In my last few navigation videos, I've introduced you to some very simple, very basic, almost everyday navigation techniques that we probably use even when we're not out navigating. I've introduced collecting features, catching features, and in this video, I want to introduce that third technique known as handrails or handrailing. Hi folks, I'm Craig Taylor, and as always, a huge thanks for joining me here on my YouTube channel, the Bushcraft Padawan. So let's talk about this technique, handrails or handrailing. First of all, what is it? Imagine that, take yourself away from being in the woods or being out on the hills. Just imagine you're giving somebody directions. They want to know how to find a particular pub, for example. You might say to them, okay, just head down this street here, keep the line of shops on your left-hand side, and then once the shops run out, another couple of 100 meters, that's the pub. The line of shops, the row of shops, when you told them to keep that on their left-hand side, they were handrailing that row of shops. It was there on their left-hand side. They were handrailing it. Another example might be somebody asking you for directions to a park or something like that. You could say, yeah, no worries. In order to get to the park, just head over this bridge, turn left, keep going along, keep the canal on your right hand side, and as long as you keep the canal on your right hand side, after a couple of miles you're going to get to that park. The canal, keeping the canal on the right hand side, they were handrailing that canal. They would eventually then get to the park. So there's some examples of handrails or handrailing. Handrails and handrailing, they're very usually linear features, so we're talking paths, streams, tracks, the edges of forests, rivers, streams. They could even be the land itself. It could be handrailing a valley or handrailing a ridgeline. So it's a linear feature. Sometimes they're man-made, like tracks or canals or possibly even woodlines. It could be, it could be a man-made wood as such, a plantation. Other times they can just be purely natural. But the key thing is that they are a linear feature. Now there's a couple of caveats with putting all of your eggs in the handrailing basket that I'm going to come on to later on in the video. But for now, let's get the map out and let's look at some real examples of a navigational leg where a handrailing might come in useful. To provide you with those real world examples, I'm going to be referring to the Ordnance Survey 1 in 25,000 Snowdon map of the area of the Snowdonia National Park. Let's take a look at some of these real world examples then. Let's look at this particular section of the map then. If you look at the bottom centre of the map, you can see an almost saddle shaped ring contour line, bottom centre. Come north of that, and in the area on the edge of the woodland, you can see some sheepfolds marked up. Now you could, if you wanted to head to those sheepfolds, you could just take a direct bearing to the sheepfolds. Maybe you could aim off, I'd suggest you probably should do, and you could just walk on that bearing, taking into account distance, pacing, bearing, terrain analysis, relating the ground to the map and the map to the ground. You could just do that. However, if you wanted to make things a little safer, if you wanted to make things a little more accurate, if you're in poor visibility, what you could do at this point is you could still take into account distance, pacing, bearings, relating the map to the ground, all of those key navigational things. Remember, handrailing or any single navigation technique doesn't necessarily replace the need or the good practice to use others alongside them. This is a toolkit that you should be using together. Moving from that bottom centre of the map, you could pick up the stream that you can see flowing downhill from in a northerly direction, Cwmdu. You could pick that stream up. You could handrail that stream downhill until it hits the forestry block, until it disappears into the forestry block. When it hits the forestry block, you could turn left or roughly northwest, and you could handrail the edge of the forestry block until you eventually got to those sheepfolds. So there are some examples there. The stream is a handrail, it's a linear feature. The edge of the forestry block is a handrail, it's a linear feature. Using those in conjunction with all of the other navigation techniques that we've been talking about in this video playlist will help to make your navigation safer, more accurate, less prone to error. Let's take another example. If you look up towards the top left-hand corner of your screen, you can see a three-way track junction, and it is also marked up as sheepfold singular, not the sheepfolds plural that's also in the general area. Sheepfold singular. It's just below in height the 350 metre contour line. If you look towards the bottom right-hand corner of the screen, you can see Marshalling Moor Reservoir. We want to move from the sheepfold to the reservoir. Once again, distance, pacing, bearing, relating the ground to the map and the map to the ground, breaking that entire leg down into shorter chunks. All of those good practice skills should still be adopted, but you could also introduce the concept of handrailing. And the obvious, for me, the obvious handrail here is to move on down the stream that's known as Afon Marshalling Moor. Probably absolutely desiccated the pronunciation of that, but you could handrail that stream downhill until you eventually get to Marshalling Moor Reservoir. Again, the handrailing isn't instead of applying the other good navigational techniques that we've talked about, it's as well as applying those other navigational techniques as well. Let's now take a look at another example of handrailing. Now this example is not as obvious as the other two that I've shown you. In the other two we talked about a couple of streams and we talked about a forest. Very prominent, obvious linear features. So let's take a look at one that's not as obvious but could be just as effective. If you look roughly towards the bottom centre of the screen, you can see a spot height numbered 978. Spot height 978, that's where we are. If you look north of there, you can see a map marked up as an area marked up as Canad Fach. Just to the right or the east of the H of Fach, there is a cairn. It's quite difficult to see, but if you look closely, you can see both the symbol and the word cairn. We want to move from 978 to that cairn. Now moving in a straight line direction, you can see by the lie of the land there, might be a foolish thing to do and a very time consuming and potentially dangerous thing to do, to try and move in a straight line between the two. We can notice, can't we, that there's actually a black dotted line indicating a track that pretty much goes from that spot height or thereabouts right past the cairn. So we could just follow the track, but bear in mind, in wintry conditions, in thick snow, which North Wales can often get, that track could well be hidden. For me, the key handrail here is the ground itself. If you imagine moving from 978 to the cairn along that black dotted track, the ground to the right hand side of you is going to drop away significantly. You are going to be able to detect that drop even in thick snow, trust me. So for me, that would be the handrail. It would actually be the shape and the terrain and the profile of the ground itself is the handrail. I am keeping the steep ground that is dropping away from me sharply on my right hand side. And of course, doing it in snowy, icy, wintry conditions, we should be careful of cornices and things like that. That's not really what I want to get into in this video. What I want to try and get across is that the shape of the land, if it is as distinct and severe as it is in that image that you're seeing on the screen, if it is that distinct and severe, that could also be a very good handrail feature. But remember, we're not just going from the lie of the land, we're not just going from the steep drop off, we're using distance, pacing, bearing, terrain analysis, the shape of the land, relating maps of the ground and the ground to that. We're using all of those other techniques as well as the handrail and the technique being the steep ground sloping off to the right hand side. I spoke earlier on in the video about a few caveats, a few things to be aware of if you're handrailing, and I want to come to those now. Now we've looked at the real world examples, let's talk about some of the things to be aware of. Be aware that if you're following, if you're going to follow something and use it as a handrail, that you are following the right thing. I've actually seen a student, a soldier, a young soldier, use pylons, overhead pylons as a handrail. That's a brilliant feature as well. Overhead electricity pylons, wonderful things to handrail from, unless you're at the junction of some overhead power lines and you go off on the wrong junction, you're following it in the wrong direction. So great concept that he had, wonderful idea of using overhead power lines, almost faultless, almost impossible to go wrong unless you're at a junction of power lines and you take the wrong junction off there. But again, remember, a bearing, although it can be tricky to take an accurate bearing under electricity pylons, if you're underneath them or close to them, a bearing would have told him perhaps that he was going off in the wrong direction. So be aware, if you're going to use them, and there's a number of them, there's fences, electricity pylons, if there's a number of them in a small area, make sure that you are following the right one. But again, use of other techniques alongside it should help to highlight that error if you start to make it. And the other thing to be aware of when handrailing, more so with non-ground linear features, so things like forests, walls, to a degree tracks, even forestry blocks, they are subject to change. Walls can be rebuilt, walls can fall down, fences can be re-erected to take into account different land boundaries. Forestry blocks, of course, can be felled or new ones grow. It's not really a big deal when you're looking at land handrail features such as the steep drop-off that we talked about earlier on in the video. The shape of the land, the shape of the land, I guess it's always changing, you could argue, but it doesn't change over the period of time that we're talking about. It's a millennia to change, but the more man-made-esque features can be prone to change. Rivers are somewhat less likely to change, but of course, rivers can be rerouted, landfalls and things like that, landslips can cause rivers to perhaps take a different direction. So always be aware that if you're following a linear feature, that you are aware of the potential for the real world, which is always up to date, correct? The real world may have changed compared to what the map is suggesting. But once again, if you're using a handrail technique in conjunction with other sound navigational techniques, it should alert you to the error if you start to make it. It should also alert you to the error before you even put one foot forward on that next navigation leg. We've just spoken there about handrails. I've got a little piece of work for you to do. Grab a map, go out, grab one of your maps, find an area, find a navigation leg. Maybe it's a navigation leg that you've done in the past or that you're planning to do. Even if it isn't, just find an area on the map and think, okay, it's not inconceivable that somebody might travel from there to there. See if there's a handrail feature that you could advise them to follow. If there isn't, find somewhere on the map where you would use a handrail feature. It could be something like I've discussed here, something really simple. It might be something a bit more complex, but go and find a map now and find something between 2 points on that map that you could use as a handrail feature, along with, remember, I hope I'm getting this point across, some other sound navigational techniques as well. Go and find it. If you've got the time, in the comments below, let me know what the handrail feature was that you selected from the map and why you think that would be a good feature to follow. If you haven't got the time to do that, but you've used handrails in the past, let me know how you've gone. Where was it successful? Where did it get you out of the stuck? Where did it go wrong? Maybe you were using a handrail, but you fell into one of the traps that I talked about just a few minutes ago. Where did the handrailing technique perhaps go wrong? If it did go wrong, what, with the benefit of hindsight, could you or should you have perhaps done to prevent it from going wrong back in the day? Let me know in the comments below. I also talked to everyone in the video, didn't I, about some other videos that I've put out recently, catching features and collecting features. If you've not yet had the chance to look at those, or you fancy a revision, they're coming up on the screen. Let me just get my head out of the way. They're coming up on the screen now. Why don't you click through those, take a look at those, and realise how both of those and handrailing can start to come together to give you some very, very simple, effective, almost everyday navigation techniques that you can use to enhance your navigation and make you safer when you go out on the ground. Thanks as always for watching, folks. If you're not yet a subscriber, crikey Moses, what's going on? You know what to do. Come on, click on that subscribe button. Subscriber count is increasing quite dramatically over the last couple of weeks. Let's see if I can hit 3,100 off the back of this video. Thanks as always for watching, folks. I really appreciate it, and I'll see you in my next video. Cheers.